Without further ado, I would like to introduce the first speaker, Mr. Marcos Orellana, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights. Mr. Orellana, your last year report to the Human Rights Council was dedicated to the harm and risk for human rights of the use of mercury in small-scale gold mining. Could you please walk us through your findings, particularly with regards to the impact of mercury on individuals, groups, and people in vulnerable situations? We would also like to know, in your opinion, what is needed to strengthen a human rights-based approach to the implementation of Minamata-Convention on mercury. Mr. Orellana, the floor is yours.
Igor, it's my pleasure to have the opportunity to join you in this webinar today in the road to the 5th session of the Minamata Convention's Conference of the Parties. My name is Marcos Orellana. I'm the UN Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights. And as you rightly pointed out, Igor, last year I had the opportunity to present to the Human Rights Council a thematic report on mercury, small-scale gold mining and human rights. Some key findings of that. The first one is that the sector, small-scale gold mining, is the largest source of emissions and releases of mercury to the environment by far, and that it is increasing. So while Minamata regulations and controls, they are working on a number of areas. When it comes to the largest sector, they are not, and I'll come back to the implications of that. A second finding is that the impacts of small-scale gold mining and mercury use fall disproportionately on individuals, peoples, groups in vulnerable situations. We can identify, first of all, the miners themselves, who often live in poverty and who are exposed in the fence lines to mercury in their efforts of separating the ore from the gold using this metal. Workers are also often working in slavery-like conditions. I reported about this to the Human Rights Council. There are many children workers. There's sexual exploitation of girls. There's also impacts on the families, especially where the separation of the ore takes place in the homes. All of this has impacts on women of childbearing age. Let's recall that mercury is a very potent neurotoxin that is capable of crossing the human placenta, and so that leads to impacts on the unborn child, lower IQ, stunted development, malformations, deformity, poor health, and other impacts. So that is a big group that's impacted, miners. The second group that I wanted to call attention to are indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples who live according to their cultural traditions. They experience invasions on their lands. They experience violence by garimpeiros in the Amazon, so illegal miners. But they also experience exposure to mercury in their food sources. So the mercury that finds their ways to the rivers and thus contaminates the fish upon which indigenous peoples rely for subsistence and sustenance and cultural practices is a very important issue here. I want to call the attention to the situation of the Eseja. This is an indigenous people in Bolivia, and I point this out because they are known as the people of the river. So their connection it's not so much with the land, but with the river, and they rely fully on fish for their sustenance. And so the contamination of fish by mercury has meant a disproportionate burden and impact. And that's why many observers are beginning to speak about a new Minamata unfolding in the Amazon. And the third finding that I want to point to is shortcomings in the Minamata-Convention, which, as I mentioned, it incorporates lessons learned from years and decades of treaty making and multilateral environmental agreements, and yet has some shortcomings that are contributing to these impacts. So, for example, small-scale mining is a use allowed under the convention, and because of that, trade in mercury for small-scale mining is also allowed. So that's the big shortcoming. Another is that trade provisions are rather lax, and they enable diversion of legal trade to illegal markets. And a third point that I point to is that the specific provisions and the specific annex, there's an annex, Annex C in the Convention on Small-Scale Mercury, they do not contain, for example, a phase-out timeline for mercury use in small-scale mining. So these are three very significant shortcomings. And your second question is what to do about them. I think I'm almost over my time, but shortcomings can be addressed by COP decisions that enable further engagement, such as COP4 decisions on consultations with indigenous peoples and the design and elaboration of national action plans. But the report I presented to the Human Rights Council also contains information on how the convention can be and should be amended in order to close these gaps and shortcomings. Amendments to Article 7 and Annex C regarding small-scale mining, so that there is a phase-out timeline in this field. Amendments to Article 2 so that small-scale gold mining is not considered an allowed use. And certainly amendments to Article 3 concerning trade. There's several things there. So banning the export of mercury except for sound management of waste where it is allowed. Banning imports of mercury from non-parties. Strengthening the period or shortening the period in which primary mercury exports are allowed. So these are all measures that should be adopted to strengthen a rights-based approach to the implementation of the convention. Thank you very much for your attention.